a professor, journalist, rabbi, and he's a columnist for Rolling Stone, the Daily Beast. He appears fairly often on CNN. He's written 10 books. He's written some from LGBT. He started out writing more about LGBTQ issues, and then also spirituality and meditation, and then more politics, etc. So he's very, I always say he's very much a Renaissance man. Since 2013, a lot of his journalistic work has focused on the Supreme Court, religion, and LGBT issues. And he's won the New York Society for Professional Journalists Awards for opinion writing 3 times. And he's written a lot about everything from climate change to anti-Semitism, voter suppression, other topics. And as I said, he's often on CNN, but also sometimes on NBC and Meet the Press. So Jay, I asked Jay to come to Lehigh in February. I asked him in January to come in February because at that time, with everything that was happening, and I've been following him online and on CNN, and the idea was to look at sort of as he put it, from a liberal rabbi's perspective, looking at what's happening right now, and also the focus on the ability to see multiple narratives, because so much right now everybody's caught up in their individual narratives and not willing to listen to others, and not just narratives from people who disagree with them, but from people who are in different communities. But even within the Jewish community, there are multiple narratives. There are multiple expressions of and understandings of what's happening, not just in terms of Israel-Palestine, but in so many issues. So it's not just the Israeli narrative and the Palestinian narrative, but it's the Israeli narratives, the Palestinian narratives, the Jewish. So I thought that, he would be the best person to talk about that, and he was. So as I said, what I would do, so Liz gave you doing this online is always a little challenging. So Liz did give you a link to the texts, and because there are times when he will refer to the texts. If anybody's not sure what text or they can't see it, I guess they can, Liz, what's the best thing to do? Just to say something or put it in the chat so we can pause for a second in case somebody can't find the.
Yeah, we'll toggle between the video and the maps as he mentions them, and then I also have the file there for downloading if you find it preferable yourself to be able to switch back and forth in your own app, or if you want to save the file for your own purposes.
Yeah, so what I'd like to do, if possible, is just to listen to his presentation, which and I don't know, you may have seen it elsewhere, because I know he has the recording. I'm not sure where else it might have been shown. So he speaks for about 40 minutes. If there's something that comes up in terms of a question, sort of hold on to them for later, or put them in the chat.
Yeah, you can put them in the chat and we'll certainly come to them.
Yeah.
At a break point.
And I know you have, I'm sorry, I forgot your name because I can't see the screen.
Margot.
I know you have to leave after 20 minutes, so you can always if you have any questions, you can always put them in the chat, and we can, when you get the recording later, you can maybe get the answer to them. Okay. So I'm just going to ask, but if anything is confusing along the way, if you're like, wait a second, I can't find this text, I don't know what he's talking about, just put something in the chat, and Liz can pause for a second, and I can let you know where we are. Okay, ready?
Yes, let me pull this here so I can screen share this window. We're starting with the video?
Yeah, we'll start with the video.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, let me make sure I got my sound. I didn't. Ready? Can I get a thumbs up?
For coming to this totally non-controversial talk and subject. I really appreciate it, of people from different backgrounds coming, and I appreciate you all taking time out of your day to be here. I just wanted to start kind of by introducing myself, and then just a little bit about what I'm going to talk about and what I'm not going to talk about. And then I'm going to talk about what I'm going to talk about. And then we'll have time for Q&A and stuff at the end. So the introduction that you just heard is like my official introduction. Maybe it's a little bit unusual in that I work in different fields at the same time. So I do work in spirituality and meditation, but I also work in journalism. And increasingly, really for the last 10 years, I've seen there a real convergence between the ways in which we as human beings interact and the way in which our politics works or doesn't work. And so that's something I'm really interested in. Obviously, I come from a Jewish position, but I guess I'm proud to say that I've been demonized by both Jewish press and Palestinian press. I've been called an anti-Semite, a self-hating Jew, a Zionist stooge, and an apologist for some of the worst things you can be an apologist for. And I do actually appreciate that. It suggests to me that there's a sort of way in which some of the work I'm doing is connecting with people who see the complexity of this issue while still taking a moral stand for what they believe in. So what I'm not going to talk about is why my view of the conflict is the correct view. It'll be pretty obvious that I'm sort of in this progressive Israel-Palestine coexistence world, but I'm much more interested in the process of how we talk with one another than in the substance of what we believe. Obviously, I don't need to tell folks who are on all different sides of this issue, this has been a particularly brutal period for how we do or don't speak with one another. And part of that is, I think, totally appropriate. What's happening, however, whatever our political views are, what's happening on the ground in Gaza, what happened on October 7th, this is profound. It's not like a small thing like, oh, you have some view about some issue, right? It's horrible. And that should bring out a strong, not just strong feelings, but a response of strong moral conscience, right? So some of it is like, I think, appropriate, the intensity of feeling, and some of it is actually unfortunate. And so what I want to draw on is a kind of practice created by Palestinian and Israeli peace activists around dual narratives, multiple narratives, as a way of not convincing, but seeing the other in ways that the other might see themselves. And so that's kind of where I'm situated. And that comes from my own life experience. I lived in Jerusalem for 3 years. I went on and participated in a number of different Israeli-Palestinian peace programs, initiatives, and so on. Met a lot of folks who were living under occupation and hearing from their experience. Met people who were living in settlements and hearing from their experience, and just trying to undo some of the one-sided nature of my own education growing up, which told one side of the story without the other side of the story. So it's not like by telling two sides, there's necessarily like some implication about which side is right or wrong, but growing up, I only heard one side. And so I tried to, in mostly my 20s, to try to hear more. Okay, so that's a little bit what I'm going to talk about, what I'm not going to talk about, and who I am. So as the first page, wow, it gets louder when I look down. As the first page of the handout suggests, I'll just read this little definition because it's kind of the official definition. The dual narrative approach, developed collaboratively by Israeli and Palestinian scholars, starts by acknowledging major disagreements over the historical facts, and then presents the two conflicting narratives side by side. And this is still from the first paragraph, is from the original definition. It helps arouse empathy for all parties to the conflict, and it supports civil discourse and respectful disagreement. So the second paragraph is from me, not from the official. So the goal, as I said, it's not about sort of taking a position or relativism. It's seeing both sides as they might see themselves. And I think it can be really helpful. So there's 3 examples that are here of this approach. 2 books and 1 organization. The organization at the bottom in the purple is called Standing Together. They're very active now. They were active for a long time. It's made up of Israelis and Palestinians. And both of these books are pretty intense, but what they both do is they have the people from the background tell their story, right? And comment on what the other person said. So it's not a debate, like a he said, she said debate, but there is kind of, each side gets to present the narrative the way that they actually experience the narrative. And I think that's really powerful. And so that's what, I like the way, I want to say a little bit about why I like multiple instead of dual. Because I think there's like a little bit, narratives can both reveal and obscure. Like in telling a story, I leave out some details and I include others. And what I don't say might be just as important as what I do say, right? And we know this in a lot of kind of political context, like whose voices are being centered, whose voices are being represented, right? Whose stories are being represented. And sometimes it's what's not on the screen or on the page that's just as important as what is on the screen or on the page, right? And is telling about what's not included. I like multiple rather than dual for a lot of reasons. I think there's not one narrative on an Israeli or a Palestinian side of this conflict, and there's not one narrative just around the last several months. So I'll just do like 6 really quickly. Like 6, I don't know if I'll start on the Palestine side. I'm gonna go back and forth actually. So there could be a particularly what I would call a right-wing Palestinian narrative. This is not on the page, which is engaging with Israel has brought us nothing. Armed resistance is the legitimate form of protest. That could be a view. That's very different from a more like left-wing Palestinian narrative that would say that Israel is a reality that we have to live with, and so coexistence is the only way forward, right? That's very different. There could also be a narrative in between those two, which is that engaging with Israel has brought us mixed results at best, so we need an international nonviolent resistance to denormalize Israel in order to secure justice and independence for Palestine. So, right, that could be somewhere in between. Are those the same narrative? I don't know. They may stem from the same story, but they're pretty different in terms of view. Likewise, on the Israeli side, there are many of Israelis who would support one state for all of the people between the river and the sea rather than 2. That's a pretty left-wing on the spectrum Israeli narrative, but it's an Israeli narrative. Or there's sort of the center-left Israeli narrative that the only way to real security is through peaceful coexistence, and so there has to be 2 states for 2 people. Or there could be a right-wing Israeli narrative that Israel is a small state surrounded by enemies and it has to be strong, and that strength is the only way to security. Every nation does this in the world. Israel's not unique in this way, this narrative would say. And so until there's a partner for peace, there's one government overseeing this territory ultimately, which is the Israeli government. Is that the same narrative as the narrative that says actually there has to be coexistence? I don't know. They're based in different readings of maybe the same historical fact, but they're profoundly different on both the Palestinian narratives and the Israeli narratives in terms of what that leads to, in terms of policy or in terms of how we interpret the conflict or how we understand the conflict. So I think even the notion of dual narratives is maybe a little bit reductive, but I wanted to use, I'm not making all this up. I'm drawing on activists who have spent, 30 years talking with each other, and so I want to be respectful to that as well. So that's why I use the word multiple. So, and I want to say like one other thing as a preliminary, which is on the second page under recent challenges. And I'm going to be really quick on this part because I think everybody knows this. But there are also certain factors in the way that politics happens in America right now that have caused a kind of extremization and separation that are kind of unique almost to the current moment, right? So obviously everybody knows that American politics is more polarized than it has been before, but that, and that is reinforced by kind of technology causing us to live not just in different opinion universes, but different factual universes, right? So I've had friends like in my own friend circle who only see video content from one side of this conflict, right? And there's plenty of horrifying video content on both sides, right? Most of the Israeli video stuff, the difficult stuff, right, is from October 7th, right? From the Palestinian stuff today, right? There's horrifying news from Gaza today. So the way in which we're polarized is reinforced by a technology that creates more content that it thinks we want to see based on what we've liked in the past. And that leads to, again, what's being represented and what's not being represented. This isn't the root of the conflict, right? But this is an exacerbating factor. And it actually takes a lot of work to get beyond that. And it's really unpleasant, So like I have friends who are more virtuous than I am, who like watch Fox News to sort of see what the right wing is saying, and they're like, I'm basically like an American liberal, and like it's pretty intense, right? I'm writing for my Substack this week actually, something about just American politics and like what the House Freedom Caucus is really focused on, and I can guarantee like it's just a head scratcher if you're a liberal. And you look at this list, they have 21 policies that they want to have happen in order to not shut down the government. And it's not what you'd think. It's like a set of issues that like most progressives don't even think about. Like they want to ban Chinese nationals from buying American farmland. And they want to ban an app that's used for immigrants to get appointments, legal immigrants, right, to come and get their appointments for an asylum. And their claim is that the app is actually enabling more people to come here illegally. I had to look up what that app even was, right, to write that article. So there's technology that amplifies this polarization. And there's just the nature of online discourse itself, right? So I don't know if you've seen this feature, I don't remember which talk show it was, late night talk show, has like mean tweets, where they have a celebrity come on and read the meanest tweet that's said to that person. So that's kind of a fun fact. But if you read my mean tweets, like they wouldn't be fun, right? People say things online that we don't say, something like 75% of human interaction in a conversation is nonverbal, right? How we make eye contact or how we're listening and exchanging and talking and listening. And when a lot of that conversation happens online, I mean, I'm online all the time, like I'm not like bashing the internet or something. But when that happens online, we don't have those cues and we say things that we would almost never say, right, to another person directly. And that amplifies the tendency to extremize the other and to sort of impute motive to the other that this person is purely bigoted or this person is anti-Semitic or that this person is racist. Like, some of that may be true, but there's a tendency to kind of heap that on because of the nature of online discourse as well. And finally, and I'm going to get to the multiple narratives part next, there is this kind of tendency, I think, that both sides have, that speaking to someone from, quote, the other side is legitimizing or normalizing that point of view. And so I've been, in the Jewish community, there's now a strong sort of faction that claims that any anti-Zionist speech is by definition anti-Semitic speech. It's not something I agree with. And so to sit down or so I personally have been banned. I'm here at Lehigh Hillel's invitation, but I've been banned from a Hillel at a university I won't name for having views that were too left-wing and that were deemed not like Zionist enough, and so therefore, because they weren't going to platform somebody who had such objectionable views. Me, like, not, right, like, I'm not the person like on the left, right, but I was the person who was actually banned, let alone somebody who actually does have a stronger view, right? And that's true, I think, that's obviously true on the left as well. And there's an ethical position that we need to not normalize certain kinds of people and speech and positions. And it's not a position that I hold, but that tendency is one that further, again, sort of amplifies the non-multiple narrativization of conflict. And so when something becomes very painful and very horrifying to the conscience, whether it's what's happening in Gaza right now or whether it's what happened on October 7th, there's a tendency to kind of separate into our communities, and we see through a particular one lens. And that does not, I don't think it's even really effective. There was somebody who just published a piece in a Jewish newspaper, somebody on like the Jewish Center complaining about somebody on the Jewish left. And it was this incredible, I'm not gonna say the name because, well, Rabbi Steve definitely knows who it is. But it was this incredibly condescending piece that was like, don't you think your peace activism would be more effective if you also mentioned the suffering on our side, ... Don't you think that you would be more effective if you also said, and it was this absurd kind of mansplaining article of like, here's how I think you should actually talk about your own issue. And there was like a germ of truth in it, which is that if we could actually see, if that person writing that article could have maybe spoken to and listened to somebody from the position that he was critiquing, he might have been more effective in telling them how to be more effective, right? He might have seen that this article would be not received very well. So it was ironic, like it had taken his own advice and like actually listens to the voice that he disagrees with rather than just kind of offer unsolicited advice. So there's even a claim, I want to make the claim that we might even be more effective if we can offer a critique of position in the way that the person who holds the position might recognize. Okay, that was a little abstract, but now we're going to get for real. Okay, so I'm not going to read the Zionist, the Israeli and Palestinian, or the Zionist and Nakba narratives that are here. I figure you can kind of look at them. I'm going to really summarize them and just kind of enact this as an explanation of what this is. Oh, I did have one other thing I wanted to say. I said this already, but I want to emphasize that my claim is not like we should all just get along and be moral relativists and every position is equally correct. Right? I don't think people on any side of this conflict think that, and I don't think we should think that. But when we take a position, I think it's morally responsible to do so in the context of understanding both narratives as they can see themselves, and seeing the kind of pain that's on both sides, and seeing the kind of aspirations that are on both sides. And so that's it's not to say that everything is equal, because I don't know if I don't think that's true. I don't know if it's true or not, but I don't think that that's an appropriate position for an activist to say, well, so if I'm when I was doing LGBTQ activism, it's like, well, the homophobe at the church who says that I'm going to hell is just as valid as, me and, my radical queer agenda to destroy the patriarchy. I'm not going to say that those are morally equivalent, but understanding that what I was facing was not only a certain kind of hatred, but that it was grounded in a religious ideology that had these profound roots that I obviously don't agree with, but that I could try to empathize with so that I could be more effective in uprooting it. That was a little bit twisted, but hopefully that got through, right? It wasn't that I was trying to be more empathetic to the person telling me that my marriage was morally equivalent to bestiality. It's that I want to be more effective at persuading people that that person is wrong, right? So as an activist, we're always searching for what's the movable middle? Who are the folks who, sometimes we want to energize our own base, but we're constantly looking for, well, who are the folks who I can have the conversation with, right? I'm never going to have a productive conversation with the quote unquote, the racist uncle, the person in the family who that's just where they're at. Or climate change is another good example. If somebody is convinced that climate change is a conspiracy, there is hard data that shows that there is pretty much nothing that someone can do to move somebody off of that position. But if somebody is moderately concerned about climate change but doesn't see the climate crisis as a big deal, that's the person who really can be moved by an effective conversation. We have a whole other talk about climate change, which I won't do. But it comes from this position of claiming, there is a claim that I've also heard on both sides of Israel-Palestine that actually nuance and complexity are the enemy. And I've seen it, I've heard it from both sides, which is kind of funny, right? So quote, there's nothing complicated about genocide. Well, that sentence is true, but the way that sentence gets put into this conflict is complicated. Or it shouldn't be hard to condemn anti-Semitism, right? So I got very involved in the thing at Harvard and the other universities, and I wrote a lot and did a lot of TV, right? And I heard that again and again and again. It shouldn't be hard. Why is it so hard to condemn anti-Semitism? Well, actually, that's not what those presidents were asked. And actually, it is complicated when somebody's making a statement that somebody else might see as a bigoted statement, but which they might not see as, it's immediately very complicated. And so the claim that on both sides of this issue that there's something wrong with, that complexity itself is a tool of the bad guys, whichever side that is a position that I don't agree with. Okay, that's funny. In my notes, I do the Nakba narrative first, and then for some reason I put the Israeli narrative first. I'm going to do the Nakba narrative first, which is number 4 instead of number 3. So if you guys remember, I don't know if you know the book, A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. So the opening scene of that book is the quote-unquote discovery of America, right, by the Europeans, except that it's told from a Native American point of view, or actually I guess it was an indigenous person in the Caribbean's point of view. And so you see this very familiar, again, I grew up, privileged white kid in America, I grew up with a certain certain education of the discovery of America by Christopher Columbus. And you can almost put yourself in this frame, if you imagine it like a movie, like I'm coming to the thing, and there's the person, and he says, look, it's land, and then now America has been discovered, right? And what I think was so brilliant about that was like, well, that is one narrative, right? And then there's the narrative of people who were already here, living in this land, and they see like the boats coming, right, and they've never seen anything like this before in their experience. And then all the horrors of the next several hundred years, right, unfold. And that, I think, was just a brilliant example of the multiple narrativization of something that for some people in America was kind of not a multiple narrative story. And so likewise here. So I was told in my Jewish summer camp growing up, I was at Camp Ramah for many years, I was told the phrase that Zionism and the movement of Israel was bringing people without a land to a land without people. I was told that. And that's demonstrably not the case, right? And so the narrative, the Nakba, people don't know the term, this is a Palestinian term for what in Israel in 1948, the founding of the Jewish state, a modern miracle, which I'll talk about in a second, in that narrative, is seen as a catastrophe, right? There were people living here for centuries, some degree of autonomy under Ottoman rule. Then came the European colonizers, the English, the French, the British, the French. They sort of carved up this land with no input from the people who were living here. They enabled sort of Zionist settlers to come and to kind of settle in this land. They imposed a partition plan, which we'll look at the maps in a second. And we were never consulted in any of this machination of European politics, of colonial politics. We were here. They made different arrangements around how they wanted to carve up the land. And there was not a voice or power given to the people who were living in the land. Not only that, and then culminating in the catastrophe where 700 Palestinian towns were destroyed, the ethnic cleansing of this land in 1948. Not only that, it continued. Even within Israel, Arabs were discriminated against. And then after 1967, after that war, people living in the West Bank have no civil rights. The people living in Gaza have no basic civil rights. And a system of oppression was put into place which closely resembles or is apartheid. And even during the supposed peace process in the 1990s, right, and the 2000s, settlements still exploded and violence still took place. So it's not that this background, for some people, this background does kind of, I don't want to say explain October 7th, but even for those for whom it does not, and I would say it does not excuse, there's no possible way to excuse the kind of violence and sexual violence of that day. It still is kind of the context, and then the next 4 months are just more of the same. Collective punishment, a rhetoric of genocide and ethnic cleansing, massive destruction. And this is continuous with this project that's been going on for 100 years. So for someone who's who loves Israel, that might have been a difficult narrative to hear, right? That's a narrative. So I think that narrative leaves out certain parts, right, and emphasizes other parts, but the Israeli narrative does the same thing. And understanding that narrative can help me understand. When I was meeting, I met the then mayor of Bethlehem on not this Bethlehem, on a trip to the West Bank. And he had been driving, his family actually had been driving in a car that was the same car as a member of, I forget which terrorist organization. An Israeli sniper got the okay to assassinate this person who was supposed to be in that car, but it wasn't that person. It was this guy's family, and his entire family was killed. And he's telling me this story, what was I, like 25, 26 when I heard this story? And I'm in Bethlehem, and he's telling me this story. And he was somebody who was on like the coexistence team. And then this happened to him. And he's like, can you inhabit that reality? And there was nothing that I could say that, I mean, that was his reality. And the fact that like I could, and this was like not like some rogue bad person doing something bad. right? This was a soldier who followed procedure. And it was like this family was in the wrong car at the wrong time. And this man's life was destroyed. That doesn't necessarily lead to a policy position, but that does lead me as like some kid visiting the West Bank to a certain place of empathy or even awe of this person's experience. So can we also make space, right, for a different narrative of the same set of facts, and it's in more detail written out here. So Zionism, the Israeli narrative would say, this isn't colonialism because there's nowhere else for Jews to go, right? There's no homeland that Jews could go back to. In fact, the European Jews who came to settle in the land of Israel, right, were fleeing centuries of persecution, culminating in the Holocaust, but not even just the Holocaust. That's not a place to go back to. Half of the Israeli Jewish population is not European, but it's from North Africa, mostly from either Arab countries or other Muslim-dominant countries where they were also discriminated against. That's not a place to go back to. A colony requires like the metropole, the place, right? So like America, right? This is a colonial, we're living in a post-colonial country. So on the contrary, there were hundreds of years of discrimination. This wasn't a part of the colonial project. This was escaping from the colonizers. That Israel was a miracle born out of the ashes of the Holocaust, a return after a long exile, right? There's plenty of archaeological record. There's plenty of that the Jews were here. This was a civilization that was destroyed by the Romans, right? This wasn't just sort of an expedition to a new place. This was a return home. Every nation in the world deserves a sort of pro-peace, Israeli would say, deserves a state, including Palestinians and including Jews. We're a people dispersed, but this has always been our homeland. And every attempt at partition or sharing, again, this is just in narrative, right, was rejected. 1947, which we can look at the map in a minute, was rejected by the Arab League, right? And in 1967, there was genocidal rhetoric coming from Arab countries saying we're going to push Israel into the sea. And yes, 1967, Israel struck first, but that was a preemptive strike against a threat of total annihilation by much larger armies. And then when there's finally a bit of a birth of peace, how is it met? The Second Intifada, intense anti-Israel messages in schools, in Palestinian culture. And most of all, in 2000, when the leader of Palestine, Yasser Arafat, was given a deal that was the dream, the culmination of all this work, it was rejected. And then more violence. And yes, since then, there have been right-wing governments in Israel because Israelis feel increasingly that there's no partner. And even so, there was some relative peace before October 7th. The blockades that were there were for security. The separation barrier there was security. But then the largest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, and much of the world was silent in response. And those who weren't silent seemed to condemn Israel already. So this was totally traumatizing for a lot of Jewish people and a lot of Israelis. And even in this horrible war, if we look at the data, there shows more restraint and less civilian death than in similar urban conflicts. The world reaction has validated the right wing of Israel's view that everyone is against us. Hamas has used human shields. Every death is their fault. It's a tragedy, but it's the fault of the people using the human shield. Hamas doesn't want coexistence. They want Israel's erasure from the river to the sea. We're not even on their map. Also a pretty intense narrative. Both of these narratives have truth to them. And while I could critique each point, so like, well, what about the Israelis who do support ethnic cleansing? Or what about, right, right? The point of inhabiting these narratives is to really see the pain and the humanity that's inside of each of the narratives. So that when it actually turns to, well, all right, what are we gonna do? There's an understanding of like who I'm speaking with directly. There's a really good example. I decided to do this last night, actually, so thank you to James for printing this thing out. A really interesting example of the way the narratives work is just these maps. The first maps are I would call them right-wing Israeli maps, but you could just call them Israeli maps. And the second are Palestinian maps. So the first one is of ancient biblical Israelite kingdom, right? That this is like, and look how much larger it was than present-day Israel. Or the second one, the one on the bottom, is the territory of Judea in the Roman Empire. There's a long history of Jewish inhabitants of this place. And then on the next page, this is something, and I just, again, I think it's pretty clear. I'm not like endorsing any of these maps. The British Mandate, which was supposedly there was going to be a Jewish homeland in Palestine, actually contained what's now Israel-Palestine plus Jordan. And there are some who would say, like, there already is a Palestinian state. It's Jordan. And look at Israel on the map of the Arab world, this tiny little dot surrounded by a gigantic array of Arab countries. So what's not here, right? I mean, there's sort of some claim that, like, well, the Palestinians could just go over there because they're no different from the Arabs, right? There's like a lot that's not here, right? But that gets filled out on the Palestinian maps. So in some of the Palestinian maps, these are the villages that were in this area, Palestine, that before there was like Zionist settlement. And you can even see that like, it didn't come out very well, but there are blue dots on the top map, which were early Zionist settlements. I think this is, what is it, 1926? So it's like a snapshot. And then you can see the takeover of this land, step by step by step. So in the 1920s and 30s, there are some Jewish settlements. And then there's the offer of 1947, where the yellow part is the Palestinian state, and the orange part, this was the offer that was rejected, is the Jewish state. And then on the MSNBC map, right after the '67 war, there's even less, and now there's even just a little bit even of the West Bank that's under autonomous Palestinian control. And the two bottom maps on the right are Israeli checkpoints. So that if you're living in the West Bank in Palestine, this is what you try to get from place to place. This is what you have to go through. And then there are the Israeli settlements. This map is also missing some detail, right? It's conflating land ownership with sovereignty, right? So Palestinian loss of land, but it's conflating, like, it's claiming, right, that there was all of this thing, this green Palestine in 1946, but even that wasn't true, right? First there was a kind of a territory of the Ottoman Empire, and then there was a territory subjugated by British colonialism, and it doesn't include Jordan, right? So each of these sets of maps is correct, right? And yet, if we don't see all of the maps, we're seeing half of the story. We're seeing the part of the story that conforms with the people who are giving us those maps. All right, I want to say one last thing, and then I nervously invite questions. The strangest thing about this moment, so in October, you're working in the Jewish community. It's really, really painful. And for those of us who have followed this conflict for a long time, we knew what the Israeli response to October 7th was going to be. Like, what has unfolded has not been surprising to many of us. And yet we also knew the intense pain of that day and the pain of the hostages who are still being held by Hamas. And holding both of those kinds of pain, and I don't claim to be like some perfect empathetic person, like I have my biases, I have my position, I own that. But holding both of those, even in the moment, because as soon as the details of that horrible day were clear, like, we knew what was going to happen in response because of this particular Israeli government. It was like this reenactment of this symmetrical trauma that seems to underlie this entire conflict. The trauma of the Nakba, the trauma of the Holocaust, the trauma of occupation, the trauma of living with terrorism and with war, the trauma of Islamophobia, especially here in the United States, the trauma of anti-Semitism. And now, the trauma of the Gaza war and the trauma of October 7th and the hostages. It was like the last pair somehow distilled and intensified the similarity of the pain from the different sources that had been true for such a long period of time. And I'm not equating, I don't want to make some claim about equating suffering. I'm just saying that the experienced trauma, or the experienced pain, let's just say, of both sides that had been almost symmetrical. And even that was like its own pain. So I admit that like a lot of I've claimed that this dual narrative approach doesn't have a particular ideological goal, and that's been true in my experience. So I have a lot of friends who are two-state, what I would call liberal Zionists, who support a Jewish state of Israel but are appalled by some of the actions, particularly of the current government. I have a lot of friends who are one-state, river to the sea folks, who should be one state for all of its people, but who come to that position from a position of deep understanding and not just like it's not like a reflexively held position. I used to have friends who had a more like right-wing Israeli view. I wouldn't say I really do anymore. But I think it has been the case that it's possible to coexist with these different views. You know, if there's this at least understanding of the context and narratives that they're based in. So part of that is also a journalistic, like I really do want to get the story as the people telling the story would tell it. And I'm fully on board with any critique of media that for failing to do that. And certainly, you know, at CNN, there's ample room for critique of how those stories are told and who gets to tell them. But the ideal would be holding the stories as the people themselves could tell them. And so I end not with like a position, but with these questions that I've reprinted that come from a group of activists that I'm friends with. Like, what are the assumptions? What ideologies am I operating within? Have I listened to a variety of perspectives? Am I willing to truly consider that I might learn from a person who I might disagree with? And even to consider that I might be wrong. And I think most of all, what do I think of the other? So some of the ways in which some of the charges, like the claim, it's like these pair of words, like to oppose anything that Israel does is anti-Semitic. Well, that means that the person who has this view is a bigot, right? That doesn't feel to me like sometimes there is anti-Semitism, right? But sometimes there isn't. And that way of closing a door to a conversation, for me, feels really painful. And likewise, when the word genocide is used in a not careful way, that any support for a Jewish state has to mean the support of horrible action, that too means like that I'm supporting something unspeakable. And that too seems to close the door. And I just wish, I know all of what I said earlier about like the ways in which our discourse and the online discourse happens, but when I've spent time in Palestine, listening to folks on the ground, I actually still have a small amount of hope, because I do know that there are a lot of people on both sides who actually want to find some way to live a normal life. And right now, we're very, very short of that aspiration.
Okay. So a lot to digest there. But, you know, I said, you know, the reason I brought him to Lehigh was because he would be able, hopefully, to present this idea that there are multiple perspectives, and, you know, like that is not, can't we all just get along, but it's, can't we all at least listen to the other narratives, and as he said, have empathy for the pain of others, even if we disagree with their narrative. And, you know, again, this doesn't just apply to Israel-Palestine, right? We know what's happening in our own country. So I guess he gave these questions, but first I'd like to hear if anybody has any particular responses or questions coming from his comments. Again, my response obviously is going to be my understanding of his comments, because I'm not Jay and I'm not channeling him. Though if I'm not sure, I can always email him and say, Jay, can you let me know? But
and those answers can be sent to you in an
Yeah.
email form
if you need something relayed.
if we need something relayed.
yeah. So any questions, or any specific questions or responses, reactions to what he said before we look into maybe some of his questions? Was there anything in the chat?
Not at the moment. Well, Joan was saying that she appreciates hearing the balance and the explanation and all that.
And like he said, it wasn't relativism. He wasn't saying, well, he wasn't trying to equate saying, well, they're all correct. There are aspects of each that have some historical facts and some, some correct facts, and others from our perspective, and others that are missing or that are incorrect from our perspective. Again, it does involve perspective. And I think, for me, one thing that he did that he wasn't the first person to do this, but when he's talking about sort of the narratives that we grow up with, in the Jewish community, when I was growing up, I think I'm about 10 years or so older than Jay, give or take, maybe more, I can't remember. But still, that narrative, I don't remember ever hearing the phrase, a people without a land taking over a land without a people, but I do remember the narrative was, 1948, state was declared, Arab nations told all the Arabs to get out of Israel, we'll defeat the Jews, and then you can come back. That's what I thought happened in 1948. And right, it was a homeland for people that didn't have a homeland. Then if you talk to Palestinians probably who were living around that time, I've heard this from people around my age, so I'm just trying to do my best to quote what their narrative was. The Jews came in, displaced us, kicked us out, and took over all of our villages and our homes, and displaced us, and that's all that happened. So which of those narratives is true? What's that up there?
She needs something. It's a congregant from CBS, but
Oh,
anyway.
okay. So, which of those is true? There's truth. Well, what do you think? Which of those is true? Joe, are you trying to say something? I can't tell, because if you are, you're muted.
Yeah, Joey had typed in the chat saying that he'd seen that comment about land without a people in books about David Ben-Gurion.
Yeah, that was probably a quote of Ben-Gurion.
I can see that.
The founding father, one of the first prime minister. That statement is clearly a lie. Okay. Yes, we were a people without a land, but Palestine was not a land without people. But this idea that, the 48 was the Jews came in and took over everything, versus the Arabs told the Arab citizens to leave. We didn't kick anybody out. They left because the Arab nations told them to get out, and then when we won, they didn't have a place to go. There's truth to both of those statements. If you talk to people who were there, or from what I've read in historical accounts, yes, a lot of villages were totally the people were displaced. If you go to parts of Jerusalem, I'm thinking like Baca and other areas that are, so many of the homes in Jerusalem, you can tell were at one time, from the architecture, they were Arab homes. So there is definitely there's a piece of that that's true. There's also a piece that we know that the Arab nations did say, get out, let us come in and take over. So some people did leave because of that.
But some people stayed too.
Right, well, that's what I'm saying. Both narratives are true.
Because I don't say one way or another,
Right.
but I have family that lives in a a moshav outside of Nazareth. And
Right.
one of the things that I did when I was visiting was I asked them, I'm like,
Mhm.
you know, is it comfortable here?
Mhm.
Because I was told I wasn't allowed to go visit them because Nazareth was so volatile at that time when I was there. And I asked them, I was like, I know I'm not really like
Mhm.
my trip doesn't want me to be here, but I wanted to be here because I wanted to see. And we went into Nazareth and we did look around and do some things, and that idea that they were able to live with the folks around them, that their
Mhm.
moshav did not try and take land away
Right.
from anybody, and that they wanted to live
Mhm.
in peace and connect, and they had, you know, meals together and they had communities
Right.
together up until fairly recently,
Right.
when things got worse and worse and worse. And now it's hard for folks that are trying to live those lives in sync, to even do so. Like,
Yeah.
there's a polarization that I think I worry is one of our worst exports of the United States, is
Mhm.
that the polarization and that concept of, if you're not on my side, you're my enemy.
Right.
Not, if you're not on my side, okay, we can agree to disagree, is such a very American thing. And
Yeah.
and not to be specific, but I call BB out on that.
Oh, yeah.
That is his training, being an American born Jew who transferred back to Israel, is that he comes with some of that same all or
Mhm.
nothing kind of American attitude about a lot of things. And
Right.
whereas I think there's a lot more folks in the rest of the world that have the sort of, the world is gray and we,
Mhm.
you know,
Life is in the gray.
life is in the gray. We need to agree to disagree, or nobody gets along.
And I mean, I agree with you, except I would say it's not just an American ideal, but certainly it's become much more. But we just have to look at the nationalist movements that are popping up all over the world. That, you know, it's all part of that same, right, that same narrative that has, you know, you're right. I think there's a big piece of that's rooted in the United States, but you know, it's that idea of so many different people in so many different places, that, you know, the ultranationalism and this ability, this lack of ability to listen to the other side, which, as you said, a lot of it is also fueled by social media.
Yeah.
You know, there was a speaker at Lehigh a couple of weeks ago, from Stand With Us, which is a fairly, I don't know, I would say it's somewhat right-wing traditional perspective on Israel, although they did say, you know, like the speaker started out saying, you know, the Nakba was real for Palestinians as much as the Independence Day was real for Jews. And she actually said, if you're a Zionist and you're not also in favor of a Palestinian state, then there's something wrong, which is, again, there are people who disagree with that. But, you know, at the end, there were people from this more pro-Palestinian group at Lehigh who listened very respectfully, but then got into a Q&A, and they started spouting these facts about, you know, well, what about when Israel did with this? And she was like, well, where's your source of that? You know, this is what happened that year. And the source was Twitter. And when the person said Twitter, a large percentage of people in the audience giggled, because, you know, the woman, even though I didn't 100% agree with her or like her way of presenting, she was giving the facts. Like, you know, somebody was talking about, well, what about when, you know, in this year when, you know, when there were negotiations, and she was like, there were no negotiations in that year. But here are all the times when Israel, you know, did offer land, et cetera, that got turned down. And then, you know, but the other person was coming back with their responses, which were based on social media. And that's a real problem.
Mm-hmm.
And it happens in the other direction too. I mean, certainly, you know, pro-Israel people also are going to be, you know, quoting, you know, misinformation from social media.
Like his point was in the beginning, we're no longer operating from the same set of facts.
Right.
You will be shown 10 posts, you will be shown 10 different posts, you'll be shown 10 different posts
Right.
as well,
Mm-hmm.
based on what the news thinks we're most likely to
Mhm.
click.
Yeah.
So we're all trying to make a concrete opinion based on disparate ideas that we're cobbling together
Mhm.
from someone else's curated list. And it's a
Right.
computer's list.
Yeah.
But so now how do we get into these environments where everybody puts the same facts on the same table
Right. Right.
and then develops their opinions?
Can we?
Yeah.
Can we? And also, unfortunately, in the modern world now, like, how do you get information on what's actually happening on the ground in some place where there's not a lot of news media that's allowed?
Right.
Like during
Yeah.
Egypt, the Egyptian spring, like
Mhm.
what came out of that? Well, it was all Twitter.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that's where they were able to
Yeah.
get the information out. So
Mhm.
if you're quoting Twitter during a certain time period in a certain place,
Mhm.
it might be the only fact out there on
Right.
that. But that's not,
It's not the truth.
it's not always,
It's that person's truth.
it's
It
that
doesn't have a
person's
works-cited.
truth. It can't have a works cited. And that's
Right.
sort of another issue that we run into in the modern world. Like what's coming out of Iran now from one perspective might not be what's really happening. You know, and so I mean we run into a lot of really unusual things that we can't quantify in modern society the same way that we used to. I mean, you used to be able to fact check the New York Times. You know, you probably still can fact check the New York Times. You can't necessarily fact check a video
Mhm.
the same way.
Yeah. And like even thinking about what happened last night, you know, we know that there are multiple narratives out there. That, you know, there's you know, that Iran is the aggressor. There's, well, Israel's getting what it deserved because of bombing the embassy in Syria. There are those who saying, you know, how can you be condemning Israel for defending themselves? How could you condemn Iran when you're not also condemning Israel for the death of Palestinians, for the bombing of Palestinians of Gaza, which is obviously has lots, you know, has killed many more people than, because last night didn't, you know, so you know, there are all these different, again, these multiple narratives, and there's truth to each of them. You know, if you look at the convergences that he mentioned, you know, Nakba, Holocaust, occupation, terrorism and war, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, Gaza war, trauma of October 7th, they all have truth to them, you know, and that's the thing, these convergences. So we have to be able, like he said, to hear the other's narrative, which is going to contain some grains of truth, but others not, but also to hear the pain and the emotions and behind the narratives. You know, if you look at the questions that he asked, I mean, how many of us do, you know, what are the assumptions that underpin our position? Are we willing to listen to others? Have we listened to other perspectives? You know, or, you know, there's some people who feel, again, if you listen to other perspectives, like if you're of the school where he mentioned, like, anything anti-Israel is by definition anti-Semitism, or and Zionism is anti-Semitism, no matter what, you know, are you going to be able to talk to that person? Or how can you talk to that person if you don't believe that? Without being accused of being anti-Semitic yourself.
And we're coming from this separation of church and state thing.
Right, which they
And
don't
the
have
freedom
over
to
there.
criticize
Right,
openly our government.
right.
So I see it almost as you're not going to stop American Jews in some way from
Mhm.
vocalizing their loud support or lack of support for their government. It's
Right.
can you see a separation between a government and a people that other people sometimes lump us in with, oh, you're Team Bibi. Okay, these are very different things. They're just,
Yeah, I mean, how many people, have heard, especially in recent years, if you did, although there's always been this sort of love it or leave it ideology, but, I was always taught, no, if you love it, you stay and you fight for what you believe in,
Yeah.
as opposed to, okay, and acknowledge the things that you don't believe in, but you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater in a way.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
And that's becoming less and less possible. If we look at some of the rhetoric in this election and in the last elections, if you don't like America, or if you say something that you don't like about America, you're being un-American.
Yeah.
Like, no, that's actually wrong. It's the exact opposite.
you
You are
cannot be more
being
yeah.
American.
Right. And same thing in Israel, I think under the, and the one thing that he brought up, which is very true, and if you talk to Israelis who are trying to think of like the Hartman Institute where I studied, where they're really trying to have dialogue and help people understand, this idea that why all of a sudden, I mean, for years and years, if you look at history of Israel from the beginning through, for the most part, through Rabin, his memory of blessing, and a little after that, the strongest party for many years was the Labor Party, which is the left-wing party. Then now Labor barely has any, has no power anymore, but that, everything changed and Netanyahu really got his mandate, and he's been, I think he's been prime minister too long, and nobody should serve prime minister that
Term
long in
limits,
any
right.
country.
Term limits
But-
should exist,
right.
yes.
But the idea that Israelis, voted him in and got further and further to the right was from the Israeli perspective, because as he said, they didn't feel they had a partner in peace, when they were, living through two intifadas. That's why, we hear, rhetoric today, globalize the intifada and that, that's really, for me, that's really scary, because I know the intifada was blowing up restaurants and cars and buses and all of that. Whereas you would talk to some people, Palestinians, who would agree like that was wrong, that wasn't the way to do it, and others who would say, like you said, that's the only way that we're going to be able to fight. All of these narratives are out there, but it's true that the Israeli public went further and further to the right, which is how Bibi stayed in power, because of the intifadas and the lack of what was seen as lack of a partner in peace. Now they're seeing a different perspective because of what's happening in Gaza, and again, there's multiple perspectives on that, but another speaker that we had, was the twin brother of somebody who was killed on October 7th. And somebody asked him, what do you think about Netanyahu? And I won't quote exactly what he said, but it wasn't anything, there was nothing nice to be said. And he basically said, he said, I believe what a lot of Israelis believe, that all he cares about is staying in office. So there's a shift happening because of Gaza. But there's still these multiple narratives, even for those who want Netanyahu out. So how do we listen, how do we listen to those? Yes.
Joey was mentioning, I think it's also important to remember that Israel has problems with disenfranchised votes, including Jews, such as the Mizrahi minority.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, there are plenty, Israel definitely, there are a lot of problems in terms of, the whole white settler colonial narrative, how much of that is true, are Jews white, are Israelis white, but then, maybe, I don't know that anybody's, but there is definitely a difference between Ashkenazi and Sephardim, even though Sephardim and Mizrahi Jews are majority, or at least a large, very large minority. The people with the most power from the very beginning were Ashkenazim.
Yep.
And that's a problem. That's definitely a problem. What do we? I guess if we look at these four questions at the end. I don't know that people want to answer these out loud, or if this is just something to think about for yourselves.
The one I was thinking for me was, am I willing to truly consider that I may learn from this person?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's so easy to very quickly in a conversation go, oh, I know what you're about. I know where you're coming from, and you've got nothing that I'm gonna hear.
Right.
And that's on me if I'm not the one, because there is no learning without listening. And there's always more to learn, unless it's somebody who's significantly less informed than you, but then you have the opportunity to inform them in some fashion.
Yeah.
But it's hard sometimes not to immediately feel like something's directed at you because of the gross oversimplification of people thinking Zionism equals Jew, equals government, equals politician. Because there's so many gross misunderstandings happening right now in our direction and theirs, or all around. Am I willing to consider that I may be wrong? I always approach it knowing I'm probably wrong about most things. It's just figuring out which ones they are.
And there are some things that we're not wrong about. Like, he talked about, that he has conversations with people who think that his marriage is an abomination. Well, he's not doing it to try and convince that person, because he knows for the most part those people can't be convinced, but also hearing what the other has to say will help him in the effort of talking to other people who might be on the fence and need to understand things better. And I definitely, as a queer person, I definitely can relate to that, though I don't necessarily have those conversations. But I read about other people's conversations. So I know, what are the different, he wrote a great book called Gay versus God.
God versus Gay. I have a copy. He's
God versus Gay.
Yes.
Because he came to Lehigh for that.
Oh, right. Not particularly thrilled with the title, but he gives all the reasons why, if you look at Jewish and Christian scriptures, nothing actually condemns homosexuality as we know it today. But he has to know what the other people, those who are saying, yes, the Bible condemns homosexuality, he has to know where they're coming from so that he can refute them. So the same thing when it comes to whether it's LGBTQ issues or Israel or other political issues, we have to have some kind of a sense of, maybe we can learn from the other person, and maybe we're not going to learn, maybe what we learn is horror, and what we're going to use to help support ourselves in our position. But maybe there are pieces, again, going back to the narratives about Israel. Until a certain point in my life, if I hadn't talked to Palestinians or read about Palestinian perspectives, I would still be thinking right now that it was all, the Arab nations told the Arabs to leave, and it was a land without people and all of that. I would still believe that if I didn't talk to or read, what others had to say. So it's important to learn, but so many of the perspectives out there right now, it's really hard.
Very.
I'm also particularly I was just thinking again about how we're all pulling from different facts
Right,
until you can sit down and have a conversation and compare notes.
right.
There's now news services that will deliberately give you a blue feed or a red feed based on what you want.
Absolutely.
And I want the news.
Yeah. Is it, what did somebody online
Wilma
say?
said that's right, yeah.
Yeah, and I think, yes, I know that for the most part, I'm not gonna agree what's coming out on Fox News, but, and I've listened to it and I listen to it until I get furious and nauseous,
Nauseous.
and I feel like, okay, that's all I can listen to, but you know, I probably should be listening to it more because I need to know what others are hearing who are only getting that feed.
Yeah.
You know, I walk into my apartment building and I know there's the woman downstairs from me whose window I can see outside the apartment. She always has Fox News on.
Yeah.
And my initial thought is, really? People watch Fox News? Yeah, lots of people watch. You know, it's still I don't know if it's still the most watched news source in the country, but it's up there and that's scary.
And the media bias chart is your friend. I always tell that to people.
And, you know, the people, when they try to have somebody on that is more balanced, but that happens in the liberal media as well.
Absolutely. Is anybody online? Wilma, Rebecca, Joan, Joey, anybody have anything you want to chime in? Feel free, you can unmute at any time. And again, we'll send the link to the video and the text out in the follow-up email so you can have them to reference to.
Thank you.
And what I would say is, I mean, the texts are fine. I mean, with the video, I mean, I think don't, I mean, we watched it, so that's fine. If you want to watch it again, but I don't want it sort of be passed around necessarily.
I'll have people request the link for it. Is that
Yeah.
Okay. So we'll have a request
Yeah.
for the link to the video.
Yeah. But I think, you know, I still think I'm really glad that Jay came, and I wish we had more people, and I might bring him back again next year because I think, or maybe Haskalah wants to bring him in.
Oh my. John
So
says thank you.
who does?
John.
You're welcome. Thank you, everybody.
Awesome.
He was, I saw him at Bradbury Sullivan a couple of years ago.
Yes.
Yes.
That was when he.
Yeah, I moderated that conversation.
It was really good.
Yeah, he's great. I'm
Awesome.
be eating this
All
Friday
right.
show.
I'm gonna kill the recording.
All right.